Every empire that has ever existed believed it was the exception. The Romans thought it. The Spanish thought it. The British were absolutely convinced of it. And yet, every single one of them followed an almost identical financial playbook on the way down, a pattern so consistent, so predictable, that historians can practically set their watches by it. There are 7 stages to this collapse, and once you understand them, you'll start seeing the warning signs everywhere. This video breaks down each stage so you can recognize what's coming before it arrives. Now, before diving into the doom and gloom, let's get something straight. This isn't about conspiracy theories or selling gold coins. This is pure history. Economists and historians like Ray Dalio, Niall Ferguson, and dozens of others have studied the rise and fall of empires going back thousands of years. And what they found is genuinely unsettling. There's a repeating financial cycle that plays out across cultures, across centuries and across completely different economic systems. The details change, but the pattern doesn't. It's like watching the same movie with different actors every few hundred years. So let's talk about stage 1, which is the foundation: hard money and fiscal discipline. Every great empire begins its journey with sound finances. Whether it was Rome using gold and silver coins, the Dutch Republic building the most efficient trading system in the world, or Britain tying its currency to the gold standard, the story always starts the same way. The empire uses money that has real, tangible value. People trust it. Foreign nations trust it. Trade flourishes because everyone agrees this currency is worth something. And because the money is hard to create, you can't just dig gold out of the ground overnight. The government is forced to live within its means. Taxes come in, spending goes out, and the two stay roughly in balance. It's boring, it's responsible. And it works. This stage is where empires build their reputation. They become known as safe, reliable places to do business. Capital flows in from around the world. Innovation thrives because people know the rules of the game aren't going to change overnight. Think of this as the empire getting straight A's in school and building a spotless credit score. Everything looks great on paper, and for a while, everything actually is great. Stage 2 is where things start to get interesting, and not in a good way. This is the birth of financial instruments and credit expansion. See, once an empire has established trust in its currency and its institutions, something predictable happens. People start getting creative with money, banks emerge, lending increases, financial instruments that most people don't fully understand start popping up. And at first, this is genuinely useful. Credit allows businesses to expand, it lets governments fund infrastructure projects, it helps ordinary people buy homes and start businesses they couldn't otherwise afford. Credit, when used responsibly, is rocket fuel for an economy. The problem is that word, responsibly. Because what always happens is that the initial success of credit creation leads to more credit creation, which leads to even more credit creation. The banking system gets bigger, the financial products get more complex, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the amount of money that exists on paper starts to drift away from the amount of real value in the economy. Nobody panics at this stage because everything still feels prosperous. In fact, this is usually when the empire is at its absolute peak of power and influence. The Dutch East India Company was the most valuable corporation in history during this phase. Britain controlled a quarter of the world's landmass. Everything looked unstoppable, but the seeds of trouble were already planted. Stage 3 is when the empire develops an addiction, specifically an addiction to debt. This is where the government discovers something intoxicating. It realizes that instead of raising taxes, which makes people angry, or cutting spending, which makes people angry, it can simply borrow money. And because the empire still has a strong reputation from stage 1, lenders are happy to offer great terms. Why wouldn't they? This is the most powerful nation in the world. It's not going anywhere, so the debt grows. And at first it's manageable. The economy's growing, so the debt-to-income ratio stays reasonable. But then wars happen, or ambitious building projects, or expensive social programs that are politically impossible to cut once they've started. The spending keeps climbing, but the revenue doesn't keep pace. Here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. At this stage, almost nobody is worried. The economy is still growing, the currency is still strong, the military is still dominant. Raising the alarm about debt levels at this point makes you look like a paranoid lunatic at a dinner party. People who warn about the trajectory get dismissed as pessimists who don't understand modern economics. Sound familiar? And that's exactly how empires want it. Because acknowledging the problem would require making painful choices, and powerful people rarely volunteer for pain. Stage 4 is a critical turning point. It's when the empire starts debasing its currency. This is the moment the movie turns from a drama into a horror film, except most people in the audience don't notice. Currency debasement, which just means making the money worth less, is the classic escape hatch for empires drowning in debt. Rome literally did this by reducing the silver content in their coins. A denarius that once contained nearly pure silver was eventually made with less than 5%. The coins looked the same. They had the same emperor's face on them, but they were worth a fraction of what they used to be. In modern terms, this looks different, but the mechanics are identical. Instead of shaving silver off coins, modern nations simply create more money. They print it, or more accurately these days, they type numbers into a computer. The technical term is monetary expansion, but let's call it what it is, making each unit of currency worth a little bit. Less so the government can pay its debts with cheaper money. For a while, this actually seems to work. Debts become easier to service. The economy gets a temporary sugar rush. Asset prices go up, which makes wealthy people feel richer. Politicians claim credit for the booming stock market. Everyone's happy. Except that the cost of living starts creeping up. Groceries get more expensive. Rent goes up. The average person can't quite explain why their paycheck doesn't stretch as far as it used to, but they can feel it. This is inflation, and it's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's a hidden tax that nobody voted for, and it transfers wealth from savers and workers to borrowers and asset holders. Every single empire that has gone through this stage has experienced the same social tension that follows. The gap between rich and poor starts widening, not gradually, but noticeably. That's roughly the halfway mark. 4 of the 7 stages laid out, with the dominoes starting to fall faster. The next 3 stages are where things truly accelerate, and honestly, they're the most relevant to anyone watching today. So at this point, the empire has burned through its credibility with the currency, and the cracks are becoming harder to ignore. That brings us to stage 5, which is the rise of wealth inequality and social division. This stage doesn't just happen alongside the financial deterioration, it's a direct product of it. When a currency is being debased, the people who own assets, property, land, businesses, stocks, see the nominal value of those assets rise. Their net worth on paper looks fantastic. Meanwhile, the people who earn wages and try to save money in a bank account are watching their purchasing power evaporate in real time. They're not getting poorer because they're lazy or making bad decisions. They're getting poorer because the rules of the game have been quietly rewritten to favour people who already have wealth. And this creates a toxic brew of resentment. History is crystal clear on what happens next. The population begins to fracture. Political movements spring up on both ends of the spectrum. You get populist leaders on the left promising to redistribute wealth, and populist leaders on the right promising to restore some mythical golden age. Both sides are responding to a real problem. The system genuinely is unfair at this point. But neither side typically addresses the root cause, which is the monetary debasement itself. Instead, the anger gets directed sideways. People blame immigrants. They blame the rich. They blame the poor. They blame foreign countries. They blame each other. The Spanish Empire saw this exact pattern in the 1600s as New World silver flooded the economy and destroyed the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. The gap between the Spanish aristocracy and the common people became a canyon, and the political infighting that followed made the empire incapable of responding to external threats. Rome experienced it too. By the 3rd century, the wealth gap had become so extreme that the empire essentially split into different economic zones, with different regions barely functioning as a unified state. The pattern is always the same. Economic stress gets converted into social stress, and social stress gets converted into political paralysis. The empire doesn't just become poorer, it becomes angrier. And angry, divided societies make terrible decisions, which leads perfectly into stage 6, the loss of reserve currency status and international trust. This is arguably the most devastating stage because it creates a feedback loop that's nearly impossible to escape. Here's how it works. For most of its dominance, the empire's currency serves as the world's preferred medium of exchange. Other nations hold it in their reserves. International trade is conducted in it. This gives the empire an extraordinary privilege, essentially the ability to export its inflation to the rest of the world. When the empire prints more money, it's not just its own citizens absorbing that dilution. It's everyone who holds that currency globally. But this privilege depends entirely on trust, and trust once lost doesn't come back with a press conference or a policy announcement. It evaporates slowly, then all at once. Foreign nations start to notice the debt levels. They notice the currency debasement. They notice the political instability. And quietly, without making a big fuss about it, they start diversifying. They buy gold. They make bilateral trade agreements that bypass the empire's currency. They slowly reduce their holdings. The empire, of course, barely notices at first. The shifts are small, but each small shift makes the empire's financial position slightly worse, which accelerates the debasement, which accelerates the loss of trust, which accelerates the diversification. That's the feedback loop, and once it's spinning, stopping it would require the kind of fiscal discipline that the empire abandoned back in stage 3. The British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency for over a century. The transition away from it didn't happen overnight. It was a slow bleed that accelerated after the World Wars, until the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 formally handed the crown to the US dollar. The British didn't wake up one morning and discover they'd lost reserve status. It happened gradually, then suddenly, and by the time it was obvious, it was far too late to reverse. The Dutch experienced something remarkably similar with the guilder. So did the Portuguese with the real. The playbook never changes. The empire always believes it can maintain confidence through sheer reputation, long after the fundamentals no longer support that confidence. It's like a restaurant coasting on reviews from 5 years ago while the kitchen is falling apart. And that brings us to the final act, stage 7, the monetary reset and restructuring. This is where the story either ends in managed decline or outright chaos, and the difference usually comes down to leadership. At this stage, the debt is unsustainable. The currency has lost significant value. Social cohesion is fraying. International trust is gone. Something has to give. Throughout history, this reset has taken different forms. Sometimes it's hyperinflation, where the currency effectively goes to zero and people start using something else entirely. Weimar Germany is the textbook case, where people famously needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, though that was a post-war situation with unique pressures. Sometimes the reset is a formal devaluation, where the government simply declares that the currency is now worth less. Roosevelt did this in 1933, when he revalued gold from roughly $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce, effectively devaluing the dollar by 40% overnight. Sometimes it's a complete systemic overhaul. New currency, new institutions, new rules. The French went through this multiple times, most dramatically after the revolution when the assignat currency collapsed so spectacularly that it became worthless paper. But here's the thing that rarely gets mentioned. The reset isn't the end of civilization. It's the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. After every single one of these collapses, a new system emerged. New empires rose, new currencies were established, new periods of prosperity began. The cycle starts back at stage 1. Hard money, fiscal discipline, trust, and the whole thing begins again. Knowing this doesn't make the process painless, but it does make it predictable, and predictability is power. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Understanding this 7-stage pattern doesn't require a PhD in economics. It just requires paying attention. Every empire that has ever dominated the world followed this same arc, from discipline to excess, from trust to debasement, from unity to division, and ultimately to reset. The names and dates change, but the human behavior driving it never does. The real question isn't whether the pattern will repeat. It always does. The real question is where on the timeline we are right now, and what that means for the decisions being made today.